thank you. And welcome you too. I'm happy to see so many faces directly after lunch, but that's good to know. So, as you see in the picture, I will talk about what I call the Bermuda Triangle of rights in digital media, namely the parents, the children, and the state. And I think I have to start with something absolutely catastrophic, so for you to wake up. And as I'm a lawyer, I swear that I won't bore you with any paragraphs. I think I only have one exception, but otherwise I'll try to remain strictly transfer-orientated, as we call it. So let's start with the Bermuda Triangle. Why that? Because the Bermuda Triangle is a mystery to many of us, if not all, and everybody, or at least somebody, who drives or flies into that region before the southeast coast of the US sometimes never comes out again, never comes back. And that's why I thought this might be a good picture for what I'm trying to present to you today. The Bermuda Triangle of digital rights. I will show you what the struggle is between these three perspectives, and especially in times where children's rights are gaining strength more and more. How does that fit within this stable triangle, and what do these stronger rights of children now mean within this relationship? Are we looking forward to new clashes, or is there something that can help us in balancing those rights and duties? So, this is our Bermuda Triangle, and I'm applying a trick here. As I said, the triangle is between the children, the parents, and the state, but actually lawyers do not like too strong and static relationships, so I made bubbles out of it. But you see still that there's a triangle, and I'm trying to show you the way out of this. And when it comes to lawyers, we are not talking about the individual persons or institutions, but more of their rights or duties. So what we find since like 40 years or even more is that there are different legal frameworks in place all over the world, and in Europe and in Poland, that grant rights or oblige somebody with specific duties. So in this example today, it's about the children's rights, specifically with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also with the Charter of the European Union, for instance, and the national constitutions. They all grant children specific rights. On the other hand, you have the parents. They also have been granted rights, educational rights, for instance, or parenting rights. And then there's the state. The state is obliged to protect children, to consider parental rights, and so there's a relationship going on between these three. If we look at the children's rights specifically, we have a lot to learn from the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, specifically when it comes to digital media. So we have the right to seek information, the right to express and communicate, the right to educate, the right to play, right to privacy, right to participate, and of course the right to development. If we look further towards the parents, there's also something going on, because many of the legal frameworks grant those parents, oh, thank you, that's great, the right to nurse, to educate, or to provide direction for their child. And third, the state duties are usually the same: the duty to protect children, the duty to educate. Maybe this is also a right, but I wouldn't talk of rights of states, but more of obligations. Now, this is the situation that we knew since whenever. And now that the Children's Rights Convention comes into place, what we can observe is that the content of the convention is gaining strength, both at the policy level as on the media practice level. So what do we do with these strengthening rights of the child? What we can see is that these rights become more powerful. We are much more often talking about children's rights in the digital media, and the Council of Europe recommendation from summer of last year, where they try to apply the convention on the field of digital media and then develop a lot of very specific aspects of the children's rights in digital media, is somewhat powerful to paint the picture that we are currently seeing. But what does this mean for our bubble struggle over here? What does it mean when children's rights become more powerful? How does that shape the relationship between children's rights on the one side and parents' rights and state duties on the other? Are we looking to something like Game of Thrones, where all the actual rights and duties are in fight with each other, battling each other? Is that what we run into currently? I'd say no. Chill. Because if we take a closer look, especially from a legal theoretical perspective, then we can see that there's something going on that can actually help us when we talk about strengthened or empowered children's rights. So first, some examples for those alleged new clashes between those bubbles. So for instance, when it comes to parents trying to limit children's rights, we talk about access to devices. You won't get an iPhone, or you will get an iPhone once you're in high school. We talk about internet access in general or for specific times. We talk about the prohibition of specific apps. You won't get TikTok on your mobile, for instance. And we talk about tools that are planned or developed for parents to monitor their children, what they are doing online, with whom they have contact with. And we talk about new phenomena like Sharon Ting, where parents put pictures of their youngsters online, sometimes even publicly available. So this is the struggle between children's rights and parental rights that we talk about. And I will give the solutions to these examples later on. Between state and children's rights, it's very classic. So the state is, via law, prohibiting something or obliging someone. For instance, when it comes to age gating or illegal content, so no youngster below the age of 18 is allowed to access specific media. We talk about the prohibition of specific apps or platforms to use for children younger than a specific age, or the renowned delegation of data processing consent to parents as the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation from last year, introduced. And third, there's another clash between the state and the parents, namely then when states prohibit or oblige parents to do something within the field of media education. This might be an obligation to age verify or age verification, risk-focused media education, so to tell parents how they should educate their children, or to mandatory web filters, so that the parents have no more options to actually blacklist or whitelist something, but they have to buy the parental filters as they are. So no more individualized media education for those parents. And this all seems quite complex, But if we take a closer look at these three bubbles, I think I can give you a solution how to cope with these areas of clashes. Because, first of all, we have to look at the aims. What are the objectives of those rights and duties? And this is becoming more clearly then, because the main objective behind the children's rights is that they become healthy adults. That's all. Unimpaired development of one's personality. That's it. Of course, that's a very broad term, and you have very difficult subsets or aspects below that. What I showed here is the main development goals of autonomy, self-responsibility, social competence. So this is why we have children's rights and why these children's rights also apply to digital media use. But well, how does that help us when we think about parental rights, for instance? Well, why do we grant those parental rights in the first place? Because the parents are the ones who know their child the best. So they can decide what is good for their child and what not. But what is underlying here is that the parents are being granted some of those children's rights as fiduciaries, as someone who tries to implement those rights on behalf of the child. Actually, parental rights are being granted with the same objective as the children's rights themselves: unimpaired development of one's personality. And what about the state duties? Why does the state have the right or the duty to educate children? Why does he have the right to take over once, for instance, parents are not able to parent or nurse their child? This is because also the state is obliged to somehow guarantee that there's an unimpaired development of one's personality. And now the picture becomes much clearer because all those different bubbles are actually aiming at the same objective. And this is the unimpaired development of the child. So this makes things much easier when it comes to balancing those three bubbles and underlying interests here. And I brought some examples, but before that, there are at least 2 to 3 underlying or basic principles when it comes to this balancing tasks. One is that there's the principle of the child's best interest in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and the idea or the model or the theory of evolving capacities, meaning that children acquire skills and acquire cognitive higher functions during their growing up. So these are communicating tubes. The child's best interest changes with its biological and psychological development. That is, we have to consider that and to keep it in our head. So with all media education measures, there's one thing to know: it has to be age appropriate. Based on that, we have to use age appropriate measures and educational practices. And then there's a third principle. This is the right to be heard, or the right to participation, and this obliges specifically the state to include children's views when establishing or developing such measures. And it's not sufficient to consider only studies that are out there and then say, well, yeah, regarding this study, it's okay that we apply this measure. No, you have to talk to children, actually, as a state. And another yardstick that you can use is always the intensity of the measure that you plan. And it's quite easy. I brought only one example here. You can say how intensive is the measure if I plan to cut access to the internet or to end devices at all, then there's a highly intensified infringement of children's rights. It gets better the more specific the measure applies. So for instance, if you prohibit access to a single piece of online content, of course it's not such a big infringement for communicative participation of children compared to access to, for instance, YouTube in general. Now, we can apply these guidelines and principles to media education in schools or with parents too. You have to keep in mind that this is based on the Convention of the Child's Rights, so it's not applying to parents specifically, it's applying to states. But then again, when you remember the bubbles, the parents are granted parental rights because they should introduce and implement the children's rights on behalf of their child. So this is why we can use those ideas for media parenting too. And here again, the right to be heard, the right to participate, and the principle of evolving capacities can help a lot. But this also makes clear that parents and the role between parents and the child changes somewhat under these new perspectives, namely from guidance and direction, including you don't do that or you're not allowed to do that, and access restrictions, you are not ought to use YouTube, for instance, to something softer, like advice, reminders, or company, just accompany the child when it explores media. So how does that all fit together in practice? I brought, I think, 3 or 4 examples today. First example is the parental monitoring of children. That's something like a hobby from me, because specifically in Germany, parental controls and parental monitoring are somewhat traditional instruments in media parenting. So the problem here is that private spaces for children, especially for older ones, I'd say 12 years and above, are extremely important for their self-development. They need spaces of their own. The private interaction with their best peers is deemed highly important for them. And someone who is controlling my every step, every move, and every communication online can be perceived as my parents do not trust me, or they think I can't cope with it myself. So that is something that is already like a barrier between the parents and the child. So my proposal or my suggestion here is to let the hands of the older child's smartphones. Of course, you can install protection against, for instance, costly apps or the unregulated installation of apps, so you can talk with your child, but you shouldn't control it and you shouldn't monitor your child's communication. And maybe one sentence regarding the time-based on-off rules, where you say you only have 2 hours per day on your smartphone. This is something that also ignores that there are very different things you can do on a smartphone as a child. You can communicate, for instance, with your peers, and once your time is over, you cannot communicate with your peers anymore. This implies that there's something going on online and offline, and you can switch off the online part, and everything remains the same, but not for children. The peer group communicates on and on online, and you just decided to disenable the option for participation when you say 2 hours max per day. For instance, another example would be that you say, okay, no more smartphone use after 8 o'clock in the evening. That is something that I'd say under this framework could absolutely be done, because then in the child's best interest, you say it's time to go to bed and you need sleep to become a healthy adult. Another example is Sharon Ting. We heard that before tonight, this morning. And this again is something I'd call a very lately occurred phenomena, because before that we had no social networks where you could put your photos on in a public way. So each time a parent puts on a photograph, a picture of his or her child online, it can be seen as an infringement of the right to privacy and to informational self-determination. The Sharon Ting is an infringement of personality rights when it comes to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And even more, the unimpaired development can be infringed by this, because you are creating, as parents, digital persona of your children. So virtual images of your children that might reflect who other people want to see them. So it's already a potential impairment of their development. And maybe the last example for today is the parental consent to data processing that the GDPR set up since last year. I think it's the most known article among media educators. Am I right? So parents have to give consent if there is data processing to happen regarding their child. And this applies to everything your child does online and your child is below the age of 16. So the thing is that this legal approach that has been enacted without asking any child whatsoever through the development process is limiting and paternalistic, because it does not consider the variance in children, so nobody under 16, or the context of those data processings. So for instance, if you have a problem with violence in your family and you want to consult an online prevention number, for instance, prevention offer, then your parents have to consent to that data processing, where you want to tell them that you have a violent parent, for instance. That doesn't make any sense. Plus, parents, as the fiduciaries here, shall consider if the data processing is okay for that child, but they know as little as the child themselves when it comes to the complex processes of data processing in the internet. So I won't read that out loud. It's just like we should rethink our classic approaches when it comes to balancing rights and duties in this Bermuda Triangle, and we need to think ahead of the technological development and not beyond. Thank you.
So are there any questions? Please don't be shy. This is your chance if you want to find out of the Bermuda Triangle. Not a single question. At least one.
Mam pytanie jako rodzic. Czy poza taką możliwością jak ograniczenie dostępu do danego urządzenia czy aplikacji jesteśmy w stanie jakoś prawnie ochronić dzieci przed publikacją tego wizerunku ich na Instagramie czy na Facebooku? Czy istnieją jakieś mechanizmy, które będą wspierać rodziców w tym obszarze?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. The thing is that, of course, there are technical measures that you can implement, namely age verification routines on those platforms. It would be easy for lawmakers to say, implement age verification routines on your platform, so only children with like 14 plus or 16 plus can use your platform. And this is actually what is currently happening with the Audiovisual Media Services Directive from the European Union, which has to be implemented until September next year. We will find such age verification routines for video sharing platforms. The question is here whether Instagram is a video sharing hoster in the sense of that law. We will see that. But if you ask me personally, those age verification routines are highly ambivalent because you create even more data because of those routines. So you want to know what the name of the child is and how old it is. So you need more information about the person who is sitting behind the computer. You try to bureaucratize media use by applying age verifications here. So I would be very much in doubt whether this is really helpful. And in the end, the children will somehow find circumventions to use the platform against the law, like we see today.
Okay, so another question here.
Właśnie, ja chciałem w kontekście tej weryfikacji wieku, Michał Rosiak, Start Orange Polska, w aspekcie weryfikacji wieku, bo możemy mówić o wprowadzeniu weryfikacji wieku w tego typu aplikacjach, ale tak jak pan przed chwilą powiedział, czy to nie będzie tak naprawdę fasadowe, bo na dobrą sprawę nie ma możliwości efektywnej weryfikacji wieku dziecka. No i w tym momencie wracamy chyba do tego, co pan mówił wcześniej, że my musimy z tym dzieckiem rozmawiać, wyjaśniać, tłumaczyć, żeby to ono samo wiedziało, że warto poczekać, a nie wymuszać tą weryfikację w jakiś taki sztuczny sposób.
Yes, I think that's, again, a good notion, artificial mechanisms, because this is a situation that people like us think about when it comes to restricting minors from specific platform. It just won't work in practice. Plus, if you have a child that is highly skilled, highly reflective when it comes to media use, highly critical, so it has all the skills it needs, a static age prohibition would just not make it possible for those children to participate. So as a parent, you wouldn't have the possibility to decide whether this is suitable for your child or not. So you just have to take the strict age barrier here. So I've written a longer piece. I'm currently working on the translation in English to that, where I show how the different interests between age verification on one hand and the children's rights on the other hand are being balanced, but not towards the rights of the child, but more towards the duties of the platform providers. For them, it's a relatively intriguing measure, because they can show they have implemented that measure, and then that's it. While the children who are actually capable of using those platforms won't have the option to do so anymore.
Okay, another question here.
Dzień dobry, Barbara Michalska. Ja mam takie pytanie, ponieważ odnosił się Pan w swoim wystąpieniu do interesu dziecka, które jest bardzo szeroko pojmowane przez różne dokumenty rządowe, przez konwencje. Czym jest ten interes dziecka? I czy jest łatwy do ustalenia?
Okay, the interest of the child is as the governmental documents you just mentioned show, is a two-pillar based idea. Namely, one where we try to apply what we think is good for a child to that matter, and the other one is that we ask the child what the child wants. And then you see where there's an overlapping area where both think this is the best thing to have for the child. But of course, you run into gray areas where the child says, I want to play computer until midnight, and you say, well, it's not in the best interest of you. So there are the clashes that I was talking about, and we won't cope with those, but this is the leeway that especially the parents have when it comes to applying the best interest of the child. But within this leeway, yes, you are free to choose.
Any more questions for Stephan? No, I think they took your advice and they all chill. So thank you very much.